The last step of our solution is going to be to set up Jenkins to deploy the website to an S3 bucket. Here we have Jenkins, and for this solution, you don't have to worry about installing any plugins. The only thing you're going to need is the AWS CLI. So the first step is going to be to create an item. So on the left-hand side, just click on New Item. And then let's enter a name. And here, the name needs to be the same name that we're using in our code. So let me just quickly go back to the code. Now, if we go to handlers.js, so in the deploy intent, when I build the full URL, I'm passing deploy as a job name. So that's exactly the name that we're going to have to use there. So back to Jenkins, the item name should be deploy. Then the type of job should be pipeline. And click on OK. Then remember that I mentioned that we're going to need one parameter. Going back to the code again, if I go to helper.js, right here on the right, we've got build with parameter. So we need a parameter, and the parameter that we need is called environment. So let me copy this back to Jenkins. Then here on the first section, you have this project is parameterized. So click on that. Let's add a parameter. And the parameter that we need is just a string, right? Because it's going to be either staging or production. So click on string parameter. The name should be the same one that we're using in our URL, in our code. Default value, let's say we're going to deploy to staging if we don't specify anything. Or if you really want to specify something, so you want to force whoever is calling Jenkins to specify a parameter, you can just leave this empty. So that's entirely up to you. I'm just going to leave staging for now. And here's just a description of this parameter. So I'm just going to write the environment where the website will be deployed to. Okay, so moving on to build triggers. So build triggers, so this is how the job is going to be triggered. And because Lambda is going to be triggering this job, we need to select trigger builds remotely. And it even says he's from scripts. And the thing that you need to set up here is the authentication token. And the authentication token, that's our job token that we're passing here in our URL. So after build with parameters, we're passing token. And this is exactly the token that we need to set up. Here, it can be anything you want. So I'm just going to choose a completely random token. So just a bunch of letters. All right, now the next thing. So advanced project options, that's pretty much just a display name. So I can just call it deploy. Then the important thing, which is the pipeline. For now, we're going to create a hello world pipeline just to see things working. And then after we make sure that things are working, we're going to develop the pipeline to deploy the website to the bucket. So if you're not familiar with the syntax, on the right hand side, there is try sample pipeline. So you can just click on that and then click on hello world. And this is just a very simple pipeline. Let's take a look at this code before we do anything so we understand what's happening here. So this is the syntax if you want to create a pipeline in Jenkins. So you start by defining a pipeline. Then after that, you need to define the agent. So agent, imagine that you have, for example, 5 Jenkins servers, and these servers, they have a specific purpose. So for example, one of them could be to build Docker images. The other one could be to build Java applications. And you can also have another Jenkins worker that is CPU optimized for, I don't know, load testing, something like that. You could have another instance which is memory optimized. Anyway, you can have different types of instances, and these are the agent for your pipeline. When you configure Jenkins, for each one of these instances, you can give them labels, right? And so for example, the Docker one, you can give the label Docker. So then here, what you could say, if you, for example, you want to execute this in the Docker instance, you can say the agent is going to be a node, right? So the node is the instance, the worker. And then you can say the label. So you can specify the label. So if I specify label Docker, then Jenkins has a list of all of the worker servers, and the Docker instance has a label Docker. So then what Jenkins is going to do is going to take your pipeline and execute all of the code in that instance. So this is how you can choose where you're going to run your pipeline. Now the way we had before, so you had any This means that I want to execute this in any of the workers. It doesn't matter where it is. Of course that here I only have one Jenkins instance, so it's gonna get execute on this instance. But if you have a fleet of instances, if you specify any, that means the code can run anywhere. Then on line 4, we have stages. And basically a pipeline is a set of stages. So you could have stage for example, building an application, for testing it, for deploying, running load testing, running smoke tests. So a stage is basically a set of tasks that you're gonna execute. In this example, we only have a single stage, which is called hello. So this stage right here. And within a stage, we have a set of steps. So first, line 4, we define multiple stages. Then for each one of the stage, we have a set of steps. In this case, I only have a single step, which is to echo hello world. So when I execute the pipeline, I should see the string hello world show up in the console. All right, so let me save this and let's see it being executed. So save and then build with parameter. Just gonna click on build. And we can click on this little ball here on the left. That's gonna take us to the console output. And here is just starting the pipeline. And there you go, you can see hello world. So that means that our pipeline worked. And then the next step would be to execute this pipeline through the Lambda, which means I'm gonna talk to Alexa. Alexa is gonna trigger the Lambda function and we should see this being executed. Before we can do any of that, we need to go back to the Lambda and set up the environment variables. Going back to the code, you might remember that the code is expecting a few environment variables like Jenkins user API token. So we're gonna have to set this up in Lambda first. So let me copy the first one, which is Jenkins user. And I can go to Lambda. And then in Lambda, if you scroll down, you're gonna see environment variables. So let's click on manage environment variables. You can add, and then you put the key. The value here, go back to my Jenkins. In my case, it's gonna be Dojo with Renan, and I would advise you to create a user specifically for that. So don't use like an admin user. Create a service account. Let's say sometimes we call it service account. So create a user just for this purpose, and you can lock down that user just for specific pipelines, right? So don't use an admin user for this. But in this case, I'm just gonna use it, just to keep things simple. So going back here, that's gonna be Dojo with Renan. Then I'm gonna add a new one. And then this is gonna be the user API token. So let's see how we can create a user API token in Jenkins. The way you do that, so you need to log in with that user. You log in with that user, it doesn't matter where you are. So basically you're gonna click on the name of the user. Then on the left-hand side, you've got configure. And right here at the top, you've got API token. So click on add new API token and just give it a name. So I'm gonna say Lambda, and then click on generate. And as it says here, you need to copy this token now because you're not gonna be able to get it again in the future. So I'm just gonna copy the code or the token, go back to Lambda and then paste here. Let's add another environment variable. Then it's gonna be the Jenkins base URL. And the base URL, in my case, I'm just using an IP address. If you've got a DNS name, use the DNS name. And also another thing, that the way our code works, it expects a port to be part of the base URL. You can have the IP or the DNS name as the base URL and then have another variable for port. But in this case, I'm just gonna use IP and port with the same environment variable. I don't need the HTTP for the base URL because I'm already specifying HTTP here. So I don't need that. I just need the IP and the port. Now the last environment variable is the job token, which is the one that we discussed about. And of course, don't forget to save this. Now going back to the main page, you have deploy. So let's click on deploy, then configure. And if I scroll down, I can see this is my authentication token, which means that's the job token. I'm gonna copy this and I paste here. All right, so these are the 4 environment variables that we need. The environment variables are set up. Now we can use our application in my Alexa device to see if the Jenkins job that we created, the pipeline that we created, is going to be executed. So I can say, Alexa, ask deployment manager to deploy website to staging.
Unfortunately, there was an error when triggering Jenkins. Go to the Jenkins console to check out what happened.
All right, so this is good and bad. I guess the good part is that I know that my deploy intent worked. So this is my deploy intent, and I know that it worked. I know that it was triggered because we had this message. Unfortunately, there was an error when triggering Jenkins. So I know it got to this point and it was executed. But the bad thing is that the job wasn't triggered. And looking at the code here, I already know what it is. And this might be a little bit misleading now that I think about it, because we wrote here to go to the Jenkins console to check out what happened. But even if you go to the Jenkins console, you won't see anything there because the job wasn't actually triggered, right? So you'd have to debug your code here and not in the Jenkins console. Now that I think about it, let me just remove this. It doesn't really make sense. So we're just gonna say that unfortunately there was an error when triggering Jenkins, which we know that the job wasn't triggered. And if you want to debug your code, so what you could do is, you know that the response here wasn't 201, it was something else. So you could just do like a console log for the response and see what's going on. But here in this case, I already know what it is. And the problem is that because JavaScript is asynchronous, I forgot to put in a wait here, which means that I'm not waiting for the request to come back. I'm already executing the rest of the code. And again, if you're using a language which is synchronous and naturally you would wait for the request, you wouldn't have this kind of problem. But with Node.js, you just need to bear that in mind. So in this line, I needed to put in a wait to wait for Jenkins to be triggered and the response to come back. And because this is an await, remember that whenever I'm making a call to a function and putting an await in front of it, the enclosing function, which is in the case is the handle, that needs to be async. So now I know that we're gonna wait for Jenkins to return the response, and then we're gonna analyze the response status code. Okay, since I made a change to my function, I just need to zip it up again and upload to Lambda. So back in my terminal, I can just remove the other one. And then I'm gonna zip it up, code.zip. After zipping, we can just again come back to actions, upload a zip file. Just click on the code.zip and save it. Okay, let's give it a try one more time. Alexa, ask deployment manager to deploy website to staging.
I was able to successfully trigger Jenkins to deploy the website
Awesome.
to staging. I hope the build succeeds. It would be very funny if it failed. Haha.
Okay. All right, so here in Jenkins on the left-hand side, you can see the build code. It was actually very fast, but if I click on deploy, and this is the one that I just executed. So as you can see, that worked. So we were able to execute our pipeline through Alexa. So the next step now is to create a pipeline which is going to deploy the website to the S3 bucket. To deploy a website to an S3 bucket, I need a website, of course. And so I'm just going to use this one from Cloud Academy. The repo is called static website example. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to clone this locally and we're going to create a pipeline. So first, let me get the code. So copy this. Then I'm just going to git clone it. Actually, before I git clone it, I'm just going to organize this because everything here is Alexa related. So I'm just going to create an Alexa directory and I'm just going to move all of the JS, node modules and package to Alexa. Okay, now let me clone this. So clone, just to quickly show you how the website looks. So let me just open this and then you've got static website example. I'm just going to click on index.html and that's how the website looks. So that's what we're going to be deploying to S3. Now I'm just going to create a folder called Jenkins. And let's go back to the code. I have my Jenkins folder here on the left and I'm going to create a file. So for Jenkins, when you want to create a pipeline, usually we use Jenkins file, but this can be literally anything you want because you're going to have to specify this file name in Jenkins. So even though the convention is to use Jenkins file, you could call it anything you want. I've seen people calling it Jenkins file like this, or Jenkins file and then dash and then a specific thing, like for example CI or CD or PR. So this doesn't matter, the name of the file. So I'm just gonna call it Jenkins file. First thing we're gonna do is to declare a pipeline. Then after that we have the agent, and I'm just gonna put agent any. I don't really care where this is gonna be run, even though I just have one server. So agent any. Then we have the stages. Inside the stage, we're gonna have the first stage, which is checkout. And this is the stage where the pipeline is gonna obtain the entire repository, including the Lambda code, the website that we just cloned. And then for us to check out the repo, we're gonna do checkout SCM. If you're wondering what checkout means, let me show you something. Back to the Jenkins interface, here on the left-hand side, you've got pipeline syntax. So click on pipeline syntax. Then we've got steps, and this is a sample step. These are all the steps which comes with Jenkins already. And for example, here you can see that build, this is to build a job. So if you wanna build another job, you can use a step called build. In our case, we want to check out we want to clone a Git repository. So there is a checkout step, which means here it says checkout from a version control. And so you have a different steps that you can utilize with your pipeline. So this is what the checkout means. Now, if you click on checkout here, you can see that you can specify a SCM, which is exactly what we have here, SCM. And with this step, you can really check out any Git repo. You can just enter the repository URL here, credentials if it's a private repo, the branch that you're gonna check out, and then right at the bottom you can generate pipeline script. But you would do this if you're trying to check out a repo which is different than what we configure in the pipeline. I'm not gonna get into much details right now. You see how that's gonna work. So I'll come back to this SCM and explain what it is better later. All right, this is the first stage, the checkout stage. Now the second stage is to deploy the website to an S3 bucket. So I'm gonna do the stage, deploy to S3. The name of the stage can be anything you want. And we need the steps. And I just realized that I forgot the steps here. So let me just do steps. So remember that within a stage, we need to have steps. Otherwise it wouldn't work. So steps, and then back to deploy. What we need to do here is to execute a shell command. So I have the AWS CLI installed in my Jenkins instance. And if you want to run a shell script or a command, you can do sh, so that's for shell. And then you put in quotes, whatever you want to run. So in my case, I want to run AWS S3 sync. So I'm basically gonna sync a local folder, which is the static website example, all the way to S3. So I'm gonna do AWS S3 sync static website example. This is the local folder. Now I need to specify the name of an S3 bucket. Let me show you my buckets. So if I go to AWS, so I have a bucket for staging. So it's called Alexa Demo Staging. And I've got a bucket for production, Alexa Demo Production. Now you see that Alexa Demo, that's the same for both buckets. So the name doesn't change, or actually the dash also doesn't change. So this is the same for both. But what changes is the environment. So this, in this case, is staging. In this case, is production. Now let's see what we can do to make it work. If I go back to the pipeline, you might remember that I set up a parameter. So configure. You've got this project is parameterized, and you've got a string parameter, and the name of the parameter is called environment. Basically, what's gonna happen is that this name, environment, all uppercase, that's gonna be an environment variable in my pipeline. And if I want to access the value of this variable, I can just copy the name, go back to the code, and then I can just use the syntax, so $, and then the name of the parameter. And the only thing I need to make sure of is that the value of this parameter matches to what I have in S3. So it's either staging or production. All All right, so that's the bucket. And the last thing, I just need to make sure that this is the ACL, so the access control list is public read. Otherwise, if this is private, I'm not gonna be able to access the website from outside. So I'm just making sure that this is a public read, so anyone from outside can load the website. All right, so this is the pipeline. It's a very simple pipeline. So it just checks out the code and then syncs the local folder static website example all the way to S3. And when it comes to copying files to S3, you can either use sync or you can use CP. The difference is that CP is gonna copy everything all the time, and with sync, it's just gonna take a look at what has changed inside this folder and copy to the bucket. So the first time is gonna copy everything because the bucket is empty, but later, let's suppose that we change just index.html. If you use sync, it's only gonna send index.html and nothing else. If you used CP, it would send everything all over again. Now, before I trigger the pipeline, I need to make sure that this is in a Git repository. Back to the terminal, I just want to show you that this folder that I have, Alexa, this is already a repository in GitHub. So if I do git remote -feed, so you can see that it's already set up. So if you want to do this solution yourself, just make sure that you create a repo. And before I commit, there's one thing I need to do. If I do ls, we're gonna see that we have the static website example, and this is another repo that I cloned. So if I sit into it, so static website example, and I do ls la, you're gonna see that there is a .git folder, which means that this is another repo. So I'm just gonna remove that because I don't need another .git folder. So I don't need a Git repo inside my Git repo. So just remove it. Now if I run the command again, there's nothing there, and we're ready to commit. So I'm gonna go back and I'm just gonna do git add, git commit. The message will be added, Jenkins pipeline, and website, and just git push. All right, so everything is here on GitHub. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click on code, then HTTPS. I'm gonna copy this URL because we're gonna need to tell Jenkins where to find the repo. So copy that, and then let's go back to Jenkins. Now let's click on deploy, configure. Now at the bottom, instead of defining the pipeline here in line, we're gonna click on definition and pipeline script from SCM. Then for SCM, we're gonna select Git, then repository URL, we're gonna paste that. Because this is a public repo, I don't have to worry about setting up the credentials because Jenkins can just easily clone the repo from GitHub. But if your repo is private, there are two main approaches for creating this credential. One of them is to create a deploy key. So if you go to settings in your repo, on the left-hand side, you're gonna see deploy key. So you can create an SSH key pair, and then when you add deploy key, you can paste the public key here. That's one of the approaches. The other approach is to create a totally separate GitHub account. It's gonna be an account dedicated for Jenkins. And if you do that, then all you need to do is you need to just go to settings for that user. So you'd have to log in as that user. Then you go to settings. Then on the left-hand side, you're gonna see SSH and GPG keys. So then again, you create an SSH key, and then you can just add a new key here at the top and paste the public key. And regardless of the approach you take, once you go back to Jenkins and you try to add a credential, then here where you have kind, you would just select SSH username with private key, and then you would be able to put your private key here. And this is just a high-level overview of how this works. I'm not gonna perform all of these steps myself because there's a lot of tutorials out there. So if you're doing this for the first time, there are tons of Medium blog posts that teaches you how to set up a credential for a private repo. Like I said, mine is public, so I don't have to worry for this video. So I put the URL here, then for the branch, it's gonna be master. Now at the bottom, you've got script path, and this is where you would specify for Jenkins where to find your Jenkins file. So in my case, if I go back to the repo, So I want to make sure that I'm specifying the right path. So I've got a folder called Jenkins. Inside that folder, I've got my Jenkins file. So here it would be Jenkins/Jenkins file. All right, before I save this, I just wanted to clarify one thing. So I'm just gonna go back to the code. On line 7, we see checkout SCM. So let me explain what this SCM means. When you use the checkout step, you can check out any repo you want. But if you want to tell Jenkins to check out the same repo that has been configured here for this job, then you can use SCM. And then what Jenkins is gonna do is just gonna take all of this information that you already provided, like the repository URL, if there is a credential, and also the branch, etc. And it's going to clone the repo. So that's why I specified SCM here. Now it's time for the final test.